You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Introduction. The Fairness Doctrine was a policy established by the U.S. Federal Communications Commission in 1949 that mandated broadcasters to showcase a balance of opinions on controversial and important public issues. Although it was discontinued in 1987 and officially taken out of the rulebook in 2011, there have been calls to revive it. This doctrine compelled licensees of TV and radio stations to allocate time to matters of public interest and ensure a variety of perspectives was presented, not necessarily giving equal time, but rather ensuring that different sides were heard. The flexibility of the doctrine allowed broadcasters to choose the format through which to present these contrasting viewpoints, whether via news programs, documentaries, or editorials. The phasing out of this regulation is often mentioned as a contributing factor to the increasing political division in America. The principle behind the doctrine was to provide audiences with a range of ideas and viewpoints, although it was sometimes wielded by political leaders to challenge opposing views, particularly during the presidencies of Kennedy and Johnson. In 1969, the Supreme Court confirmed that the FCC had the authority to enforce the Fairness Doctrine since broadcasting frequencies were limited, but it did not compel the FCC to do so. It's important to distinguish the Fairness Doctrine from the Equal Time Rule, which is still active. The Fairness Doctrine pertained to the presentation of diverse perspectives on contentious public issues, while the Equal Time Rule specifically relates to political candidates, mandating that broadcasters provide equal opportunities to all candidates running for a specific public office. Origins. In 1938, Lawrence J. Flynn, previously employed by the Yankee Network, contested the license of John Shepard III's radio station WAB in Boston, alleging that it was being utilized to broadcast biased political content and attacks against politicians who Shepard didn't support. The FCC asked Shepard for more information on these broadcasts. To satisfy the commission, the Yankee Network stopped airing editorial segments. Meanwhile, Flynn founded Mayflower Broadcasting and attempted to persuade the FCC to transfer Bob's license to his company, but the FCC declined his request. Instead, the FCC established a directive in 1941 known as the Mayflower Decision. This policy required radio stations to maintain impartiality in news and political content, thereby forbidding them from endorsing any political views or candidates due to their responsibility to serve the public interest. In 1949, the Mayflower Doctrine, which had been prohibiting radio stations from making editorial comments since 1941, was overruled by the FCC's editorializing report. This action essentially paved the way for the Fairness Doctrine, which not only sustained the FCC's position that stations must serve the broader community rather than the private interests of their owners, but also imposed two specific requirements on broadcasters. These were to provide comprehensive and equitable coverage of public affairs and to offer reply opportunities to those with differing opinions on issues. From this point, the Fairness Doctrine could be invoked by listeners even without explicit editorial content from broadcasters. Prior to the implementation of the Fairness Doctrine in 1949, radio stations only needed to adhere to the more vague public interest obligation stated in the Communications Act. Although the Fairness Doctrine was enforced from 1949, it wasn't codified into the FCC's rules until 1967. Moreover, in 1969, a United States Court of Appeals, led by Warren Burger, commanded the FCC to strip television station WLBT of its license. This decision came after the station espoused segregationist views and deliberately censored NBC's news coverage of the civil rights movement in the United States. Application of the doctrine by the FCC. In 1974, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, FCC, noted that although Congress had given it the authority to enforce a system where individuals or groups could express their views on controversial public topics via broadcast media, this power had not been used. Broadcasters had been adhering to the principles of this system on their own initiative. The FCC stated that it remained vigilant and would take further action should it become necessary if this informal arrangement proved insufficient. In a significant legal dispute, the FCC maintained that teletext, being an emerging technology that increased the competition for limited broadcasting resources, might not need to follow the same rules as the Fairness Doctrine. Two advocacy groups, the Telecommunications Research and Action Center, TRAC, and the Media Access Project, MAP, however, argued that teletext should be subject to the same regulations as other broadcast technologies, and thus the Fairness Doctrine should be enforced by the FCC. In 1986, Judges Robert Bork and Antonin Scalia of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit recognized that the Fairness Doctrine was relevant to teletext, but they ruled that the FCC wasn't obligated to enforce it. In a subsequent legal case in 1987, Meredith Corp v. FCC, two other judges from the same court determined that the Fairness Doctrine was not compulsory according to congressional mandate, which meant that the FCC was not necessarily required to continue its enforcement. Decisions of the United States Supreme Court. In the case of Red Lion Broadcasting Co. v. FCC, the U.S. Supreme Court, with a unanimous decision of 8 justices, supported the legitimacy of the Fairness Doctrine as it pertained to a specific incident involving an on-air personal assault, affirming that this did not breach the First Amendment's free speech protections. This legal controversy started after journalist Fred J. Cook was negatively discussed by a radio host named Billy James Hargis following Cook's publication of his book about Barry Goldwater. Cook asserted his right to a free response based on the Fairness Doctrine. The Supreme Court reasoned that, unlike the press, radio station operators could be mandated to abide by certain rules because, at the time, there were only so many frequencies available for use. Justice Byron White, in authoring the majority opinion, emphasized that broadcasting licenses don't grant exclusive rights to frequencies and highlighted that protecting listeners' rights is more critical than the broadcaster's desires. The Fairness Doctrine was seen as a mechanism to ensure audiences were exposed to diverse perspectives on divisive issues. In contrast, a ruling in a later case, Miami Herald Publishing Co. v. Tornillo, made it clear that unlike broadcasters, newspapers, which are unlicensed and can have extensive competition, cannot be subjected to forced access, as it would hinder the robustness and diversity of public discourse. In another case, the Supreme Court decided in FCC v. League of Women Voters of California that Congress could not block nonprofit stations from airing editorials with the reasoning in a close 5-4 decision provided by Justice Brennan. He acknowledged the growing belief that increasing communication channels rendered the constraints of the Fairness Doctrine redundant, but stated that a significant sign from Congress or the FCC suggesting a need to reconsider broadcast regulations due to technological advances was necessary for the court to revisit their position. The court also indicated openness to change their stance on the Fairness Doctrine if the FCC found that the policy was, in fact, hindering rather than promoting free speech. Use as a political weapon. The Fairness Doctrine, a regulatory policy once enforced by the United States, has been utilized as a political tool by different administrations to target radio broadcasters with opposing viewpoints. Bill Reuter, who served under President Kennedy, has openly admitted that during the early 1960s, their tactic involved leveraging the Fairness Doctrine to put pressure on conservative broadcasters, with the hope that the resulting financial burden would discourage them from continuing their politically charged programming. A former staff member of the Kennedy-era Federal Communications Commission, FCC, Martin Firestone, shared a strategy with the Democratic National Committee aimed at tackling small rural radio stations that were not aligned with Democratic views. Firestone noted that these right-leaning stations operated on a cash-only basis, which made them prevalent on such rural stations. By constantly challenging these stations, the goal was to make them view right-wing programming as a nuisance and financially draining, potentially causing them to drop such content from their schedules. In addition to this, Democratic Party members played a significant role in the Red Lion case, which revolved around the Fairness Doctrine. Post-litigation effects were highlighted by Wayne Phillips, associated with the Democratic National Committee, who stated that the most significant outcome of their efforts was not just the free airtime they gained, but the substantial success in curbing the activities of right-wing radio broadcasts. The National Council for Civic Responsibility, NCCR, further exploited the Fairness Doctrine, compelling conservative radio stations to provide airtime for counter-arguments to the content they typically broadcasted. This measure was intended to create balance in the airwaves, but was used strategically to limit the influence of right-wing perspectives on the radio. Revocation Basic Doctrine. In 1985, during Mark S. Fowler's tenure as FCC chairman, an attorney who was involved with Ronald Reagan's presidential campaigns, the FCC issued a report declaring that the Fairness Doctrine was detrimental to public interest and conflicted with the First Amendment's free speech protections. However, the FCC could not resolve whether the doctrine had congressional backing via a 1959 amendment to the Communications Act. After a 1986 court decision, Congress of the 99th session ordered the FCC to look into alternatives to the Fairness Doctrine and report their findings. Later, the Meredith Corporation v. FCC case pushed the FCC to determine if the doctrine was created autonomously under its broad congressional authorization or was explicitly mandated by Congress. The FCC sought public input on different methods to administer the Fairness Doctrine. In 1987, the FCC ultimately dismissed various proposed alternatives, including dropping case-by-case enforcement and doing away with certain rules of the doctrine. On August 4, 1987, under Chairman Dennis R. Patrick, the FCC decided in a unanimous vote during the Syracuse Peace Council decision to eliminate the Fairness Doctrine. A D.C. appeals court panel upheld this decision in February 1989, although they avoided addressing the constitutional question. The FCC argued that the doctrine likely violated the Constitution as it interfered with editorial freedom and was rendered unnecessary due to the abundance of differing media sources. At the time of the vote to abolish the doctrine, the FCC commissioners included Chairman Patrick, Mimi Wayforth Dawson, Patricia Diaz-Dennis, and James Henry Quello. Despite the unanimous FCC vote, some members of Congress opposed the decision, criticizing it for undermining congressional intent and being misguided. In June 1987, Congress attempted to enshrine the Fairness Doctrine into law to overrule the FCC, but President Reagan vetoed the measure. A subsequent attempt in 1991 was thwarted by a veto threat from President George H.W. Bush. Years later, in February 2009, Fowler reflected that his efforts to repeal the Fairness Doctrine during the Reagan administration were driven by principle and concern for First Amendment rights rather than political motivation. He recounted objections from the White House staff who feared that without the Fairness Doctrine, the broadcast networks, which were the dominant political voices at that time, would freely attack Reagan without the obligation to present opposing views. Conservative talk radio. In 1987, the decision to eliminate the Fairness Doctrine paved the way for a new era of talk radio, which was often characterized as being unbridled and sometimes sharply divisive. Following the doctrine's repeal, an astute former executive from ABC Radio, Ed McLaughlin, recognized the potential in Rush Limbaugh, a radio host from a modestly known station in Sacramento. McLaughlin struck a deal to distribute Limbaugh's show nationwide, offering it to stations at no cost. The condition was that they would have to allocate 4 minutes every hour to advertisements that McLaughlin's firm would sell to national clients. Local stations were allowed to sell the rest of the advertising time to local businesses. The Washington Post pointed out that Limbaugh had a tendency to engage in the promotion of conspiracy theories and fostering division, using sharp rhetoric like referring to feminists as feminazis. This tone of discourse was in stark contrast to the pre-1987 environment, where broadcasters using such controversial language could have been silenced for violating the Fairness Doctrine. Corollary rules. Two related regulations of the Fairness Doctrine, known as the Personal Attack Rule and the Political Editorial Rule, were enforced until the year 2000. The personal attack rule required that if an individual or a small group was criticized during a broadcast, the station had to inform the affected party within 1 week, provide them with a copy of what was said, and offer them a chance to reply on the same station. The political editorial rule came into play when a station aired an editorial that either supported or opposed a political candidate, ensuring that those candidates not endorsed had to be notified and given a fair chance to present their side. However, after the Fairness Doctrine itself was repealed, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit challenged the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, to defend the ongoing necessity of these two supporting rules. When the FCC failed to promptly provide sufficient reasons for their continuation, both rules were abolished in October 2000. Reinstatement support. In February 2005, Louise Slaughter, a Democrat representing New York in the U.S. House, along with 23 other lawmakers, proposed the Fairness and Accountability in Broadcasting Act, H.R. 501. This bill, introduced during a period when Republicans controlled both chambers of Congress, aimed to reduce the term of broadcast station licenses from 8 to 4 years. It also called for broadcasters to equitably present important topics, engage in biannual community discussions about their content, and provide proof to the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, of their compliance. The bill was sent to a committee, but did not advance beyond that stage. During the same session of Congress, Maurice Hinchey, another New York Democrat, put forward a bill aimed at reinstating the Fairness Doctrine, known as the Media Ownership Reform Act of 2005, or H.R. 3302, which included the support of 16 co-sponsors. In 2007, leading Democrats, including Senator Richard Durbin from Illinois, expressed a desire to bring back the Fairness Doctrine, a sentiment echoed by Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts. However, despite this interest, Durbin's press secretary later clarified that there were no specific plans to reinstate the doctrine. Durbin's public endorsement of it was based on a general statement made during an impromptu conversation. In mid-2008, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House from California, acknowledged that her party was not opposed to the idea of reviving the Fairness Doctrine. Upon being asked, she confirmed her personal support for its return. Later that year, California Representative Anna Eshoo indicated to a local newspaper her intention to restore the Fairness Doctrine and extend its application to include cable and satellite broadcasting. Early in 2009, Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa voiced similar support during a radio interview, suggesting the doctrine's return could counteract a perceived imbalance in political talk radio that was unfavorable to progressive viewpoints. Former President Bill Clinton also weighed in, suggesting during a radio interview that either reinstatement of the Fairness Doctrine or a creation of balance in talk radio was necessary, considering the one-sided criticism from conservative media against the economic stimulus plan at the time. More recently, in September 2019, Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard introduced legislation to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine. She was the sole sponsor of H.R. 4401, titled Restore the Fairness Doctrine Act of 2019, which was promptly sent to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce and its Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. Her bill would compel television and radio broadcasters to ensure that alternative viewpoints regarding important public matters receive reasonable airtime, a measure that supporters claim would lead to more balanced discussions and better informed public debate. Reinstatement, opposition. The Fairness Doctrine, an old policy requiring broadcasters to present multiple perspectives on controversial issues, has been a point of contention, especially among conservative and libertarian circles, who argue that it violates freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment and interfere with property rights. Influential conservative newspapers have editorialized that Democrats' attempts to reinstate the doctrine were largely reactions to the dominance of conservative talk radio. In 1987, the National Association of Broadcasters' then-president, Edward O. Fritz, praised President Reagan for vetoing legislation that would have made the Fairness Doctrine a law, asserting it restricted free speech and overstepped into broadcasters' editorial freedoms. In a similar vein, in 2007, Republican Senator Norm Coleman attempted to ensure that the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, could not fund efforts to reimpose the doctrine, although his efforts were stymied partly due to procedural issues. In that year, two legislative proposals, known collectively as the Broadcaster Freedom Act of 2007, sought to prevent the FCC from reintroducing any policies akin to the Fairness Doctrine. They lacked sufficient momentum to be debated on either the Senate or House floors. Commissioner Robert M. McDowell of the FCC warned in 2008 that discussions about net neutrality might become entangled with the Fairness Doctrine, possibly leading to the extension of content control to the Internet. Conversely, the Conservative Media Research Center contended that the principles underpinning the Fairness Doctrine are baseless. Barack Obama, during his 2008 presidential campaign, expressed through a spokesperson that he did not support reinstating the doctrine, emphasizing instead the expansion of accessibility to a broad range of media views. Mark Fowler, echoing President Reagan's sentiments, advocated in 2009 for a media free from governmental oversight, analogous to the press that uses traditional methods like paper and ink. Despite earlier controversies, President Obama's administration confirmed their opposition to the doctrine's revival in 2009. That same year, attempts were made in Congress to enact the Broadcaster Freedom Act of 2009 to formally prohibit the doctrine's return, culminating in a significant vote to attach the act to another bill. This legislative maneuver was partly a reaction to fears among conservative radio hosts of a potential Democratic push for the doctrine's reinstatement, a move President Obama did not plan to pursue. The debate over the Fairness Doctrine has led some media reform advocates to suggest that the focus should instead be on setting stronger ownership limitations for stations and enforcing public interest standards more rigorously, with any resulting fines being redirected to support public broadcasting. Public opinion. On August 13, 2008, Rasmussen Reports conducted a phone survey with 1,000 likely voters revealing that nearly half, 47%, were in favor of mandating broadcasters to balance liberal and conservative opinions, while a smaller group, 39%, did not support this idea. Concerning the Internet, a majority, 57%, rejected the idea of forcing websites and bloggers to present alternate political perspectives, with only 31% in favor. However, a significant majority, 71% of participants, believed that today's media landscape provided a platform for nearly every political stance, factoring in the Internet, newspapers, cable TV, and satellite radio. Despite this belief, only half of the respondents were actively keeping up with current discussions on the Fairness Doctrine. The findings of this survey have a 3% margin of error and are reliable to a 95% confidence level. Formal revocation. In June 2011, two leading Republican members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the chairman and a subcommittee chairman, announced that the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, had committed to a deadline of August 2011 to eliminate the Fairness Doctrine and various other antiquated regulations, as per their request. This decision to scrap these regulations came on the heels of an executive order from President Obama, which instructed federal agencies to review existing rules to discard those that were no longer needed. Consequently, on August 22, 2011, the FCC decided to remove the regulation enforcing the Fairness Doctrine and over 80 other outdated regulations from the Federal Register, aligning with the goal of regulatory simplification.